Hello, it's Diane. If you saw the haul video that I did yesterday, you saw a sneak preview of these two journals that I'm about to show you. They are both made with vintage school book readers, and they are just wonderful little books. I was going to look up to see if I could find the age of one of these books, because I have the insides here. 1900, that's this one, 1900, and I don't have the insides to this one, at least not intact. So anyway, they're probably pretty close. Actually, I was thinking 1930s, but maybe this one is, I don't know, but this one said 1900. So anyway, I'm going to start with this one because this one does say book one. They're both from different publishers. They're different series. They're not related to each other, but I thought it was interesting that when I purchased them at two different times, and I ended up with one that said book one and one that said book two. So I thought that was pretty neat. Anyway, they're school book readers, and so I used Tim Holtz paper dolls that look like school children posing for their photos on the covers, just to add a little decoration. They're kind of bland as far as color goes, so I tried to put a little bit of color inside, but I did want them to look vintage. I used a lot of vintage ephemera, real vintage ephemera, and also some of my homemade pieces to embellish with, so you'll see some of that. So I'm going to start with book one. It has the metal book corners, because the corners were just a little bit frayed. The other one was a little bit worse, but it's still in pretty good shape. There's a sturdy fabric on the spine, a little bit of lace trim, and then this printed trim that I just glued on to cover up the stitching. The back of it has some markings that didn't come off because it is so old. So I just want you to be aware of that. I'm going to be listing these in my Etsy shop tomorrow morning. This is Sunday evening. So I'm going to be listing them in my shop at about, well, let's just say 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. They will be listed in my shop, and I will link it below. Inside is a pretty little polka dot envelope with this coffee dyed index card. It's stamped with "And the Story Begins." And then this is just an ephemera piece. I think it was a Tim Holtz ephemera piece, but it's a copy of a sheet music. And then this is a vintage Denison sticker. So I use quite a few of the Denison stickers in these journals. This is a vintage guest check from the Boston Store Tea Room. And these are some of the pieces that I made with just stamps on coffee dyed paper. And there's some crocheted trim stitched to the edge of that paper. This is an illustration from one of these books. I think it was this one, but I'm not sure. No, yeah, it was that one. So anyway, it's a little bear stitched onto some craft cardstock, and then this is a little piece that I stamped. And then tucked inside is a vintage postcard of the Chemung River in Elmira, New York, which is very close to where I live. Isn't that a pretty picture? This is a vintage postcard. Doesn't have a year on it. And then here's a stock record card, which I got from the Paper Basket on Etsy. This is vintage ledger paper. And here's a piece that I stamped with coffee dyed manila folder. And here's a tag that I made with my Cricut. And this is a printable, and it's just glued to some lined paper. Here's a craft bag with this white lacy design on it, and I Mod Podged a napkin on it, and it's got a bulb pin with a vintage, I think it's vintage, it's an orange ticket anyway that I just received in a Happy Mail, and then this Kool-Aid dyed tag with a Tim Holtz rub-on. And this is a library catalog card. This is dated 1997, so it's not vintage, but you can write on the back of it. And then this is just a scrap of the patterned paper. Here's some vintage paper here, and a tab that I glued on. And then there's an illustration from a vintage magazine. Here's a page from the children's book. And this is a vintage gift tag, a sticker. And this is a little piece of I think it's a merchandise sticker or a merchandise tag. And I think I got it from Denise's shop. I'm not sure. I got pink ones from her. I don't remember if I got the yellow ones. And then this is a vintage large blue rickrack that I recently received in a Happy Mail also. Here is just a fabric collage, and this piece here I received in a Happy Mail. This is a striped ribbon that I got at Hobby Lobby. Piece of ledger paper. This piece is not vintage. Here we have a vintage playing card that someone sent to me, and this is a coat check that I purchased from an Etsy seller. Just a little piece of fringe trim up here. And each book has 3 of these tags, one in each signature, and they are shipping tags that I covered with pages from the book, from this book, with these beautiful line drawings. And I stitched the paper to the tag, and then I just stamped in some black and some green and some orange, and I love the way these tags turned out. And you can journal on the back. Here's the center of the signature, and it's coffee dyed paper just stitched together, glued together. And I folded the edge down here, so there's a little tuck here if you wanted to use that. You can write on this part. And there's some seam binding and another piece of that orange ticket. And then this is a vintage milk coupon or milk ticket. I purchased that from an Etsy seller. These are some vintage sheets this was a tracing paper pad and just a little sketchbook pad. And these are the size that they came when I got them. I bought these pads a while ago, a couple years ago, I think, at the antique store that I go to. So I tucked one of each of those in there. This one just has a piece of printed seam binding that someone had sent me quite a while ago. There's a glassine bag here with a vintage Denison sticker of a butterfly. And here's a shipping tag that I stamped on and glued some laces on. You can journal on the back of that. And here's one of the pieces that I stamped and cut out, and I just stitched it along the edge there. There's some lace here. A fabric flip, a little bit of lace. Here's the vintage children's book page, and then there's a little vintage miniature card, and it's a tuck spot if you want it to be. Some images from the vintage magazines again. This was just a border around an article. And this just little cute drawing there. The Denison sticker, and then this is some of the text that came with this in this article with this drawing. This is just a leftover tag I had where I had stitched one of Mrs. Cog's reading images onto a coffee dyed tag, so I tucked it in there. The vintage ledger. And then here are some more tickets that I received in a Happy Mail. I think this was actually maybe from a swap with Tammy. I think those tickets came from that swap with her. And then this is a French vocabulary card and a vintage photo of someplace I don't know. Actually, it says Beautiful Scotland on the back. Oh, it's a cigarette card. I didn't realize that. So that gets tucked in there. So the second signature has a little glassine bag with a tag in it, and this is a vintage, just a little card, has a scripture verse on it, and some, the Tim Holtz dolls. And I purchased this from an Etsy seller, and I don't remember, I think somebody might have sent me that. But I stitched them together, and it's stitched on as a pocket, and then I used this vintage milk bottle cap that I had purchased at a flea market. They're quite thick, and I wanted to make it part of this collage here, but it would make it hard to write. So I just adhered it to this tag, and you can take it out and write. You can put a hard piece of cardboard, chipboard or something underneath your page when you're writing. but I just thought to make it easier, I would make it removable. Here is a coffee-dyed glassine bag, and I stamped this on it and this. Well, I stamped all of those pieces and cut them out and glued them on, stitched them on. No, I can't stitch them on because it's a bag. I stitched around it to decorate it and kind of stitch things together, and then I glued them on. Here is a vintage postcard. They called it the Post-it Notes from the Current company. Really cute. It says, just to let you know what's cooking. Does that fit in there? Yeah, it fits in there sideways. Okay. Here's a piece of a little piece of doily that Tammy sent me. So I glued that on, and here's another Mrs. Coggs image. And this is just a little image from the children's book. Here is a vintage receipt from a hardware store in my area. And I only adhered the top part and folded this part up so you could see the illustration of this. It's a music book page, children's music book. And then I decorated with washi tape. Here's another fabric flip, and I stitched on a little ballerina of the Tim Holtz paper dolls. Another collage of a vintage card. This is a canasta card, and this ticket I did purchase from Denise from A Tattered Dream. And here's another of the little tags that I made with the illustration from the book. And then the pocket page again, and this is from a vintage music instruction book, and it shows the keyboard with the keys identified. And then this is cut from vintage wrapping paper. I love this wrapping paper. And I even cut out the little flowers that are scattered on the paper and just glued them on randomly. Piece of scrapbook paper is tucked in there. Another piece of printed bias tape that someone sent me. And then a glassine bag here with a bugle boy and a coffee dyed tabbed manila card and just a piece of scrapbook paper. Try to give you lots of journaling room in here. Just a little stamped piece that I stitched here, and then there's a vintage beach ticket that I glued on. Fabric flip. Here's a vintage playing card. Isn't that cute? And then another of the Current, just a note. This one says, just a line, as she's hanging up laundry. Some vintage computer paper, or as vintage as computer paper is. Somebody sent that to me, so I don't really know where it came from or how old it is. And here is a gift ticket, a gift tag. And the other side of the glassine bag with another piece of wrapping paper cut out and glued on. There's an inventory tag inside. And this is a vintage magazine image. She's demonstrating pin curls. This one has a piece of muslin gathered up and stitched, and then a little piece of crocheted trim that came off the edge of a doily, and a vintage lady card. I found this at a flea market. And then I just stitched this little piece of silk ribbon across the top of the French vocabulary card and made it into a pocket. The last signature, we have a guest check with a couple of Dennison stickers, a piece of gathered fabric. This was on a spool from Hobby Lobby, and then I stamped this piece. This had a little bit of printing at the bottom of the page, so I put some washi tape over it. Here I made a collage with 3 of my stamped pieces, stitched them together, and then stitched it on. Here's another stamped piece of a typewriter. And then this is just scrapbook paper. Here's another, it's a craft bag. It's kind of smooth. It doesn't feel as pulpy as regular craft bags. It has a smooth finish. And this is a Tim Holtz photo, and this is a vintage bus ticket from Glasgow, Scotland. I purchased bus tickets from an Etsy seller. And vintage rickrack. and another of the catalog cards. This is vintage wrapping paper. Isn't that a cute little squirrel? And a lady from a vintage magazine. Here's a vintage children's book page with this is not a vintage ticket. I just folded it and stapled it on as a tab, or glued it on maybe. Nope, it's a staple. There's a vintage Denison butterfly sticker and some rickrack here. A fabric flip with a little collage on it. A little piece of the yellow tag stapled on there. This one just has an airmail sticker and a stamp. This came from my mother's collection. This is a vintage ledger sheet, a bill head. Another playing card someone had sent me, and a ticket that I purchased from someone, and it's got a rub-on on it. And there's another of the tags. The pocket has seam binding and some S&H green stamps and a vintage ticket and a sticker on an index card tucked inside. The printed bias tape, a little pocket here with a card inside, and a vintage Denison sticker and two little girls. And this is music paper that got cut into the shape of a tag, and then I stitched it to this. It's cardstock, but it's printed like ledger to give it some sturdiness because that paper was pretty thin. Here's a stamped image that I stitched on. Collaged fabric. Here's a gorgeous little miniature playing card, and it can be a tuck spot. Some more images from a vintage magazine. Another image from that wrapping paper. This was the same paper that had the squirrel. And this is just a tag made out of graphic 45 paper. Vintage magazine image. And then here we have a vintage Victorian calling card. Mr. Wallace. I can't tell what that first letter is. So, but anyway, it's a man, so I tucked this little guy in there. And here is a vintage photo. Emerald Bay, Lake Tahoe. Then we have a vintage library pocket that I covered up with pretty paper, put some little girls on there and a vintage sticker, and put a new green library card in there. So as I said, this will be listed in my shop tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be back with the second book.